Welcome to Geveracom, where the wise get wiser. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And with that, a interesting and important word from the Old Testament, which is actually the root for Jesus' name. And we'll see a little bit as to why that is so important. Also, we're going to look at two key verses that are related, one from Deuteronomy and one from Proverbs. And we'll see how one helps us to understand the other and vice versa. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and get started with our next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And of course, as we have been doing, let's do just a little bit of practice and review on our Hebrew alphabet as a whole before we get too far into our next letter. So I'm going to do this quickly, but hopefully this is becoming more familiar and you too can do along with me. So let's go ahead and do our alphabet. So as we see here, we have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Peh, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, that's our Hebrew alphabet. So let's go through it a little bit slower, but again, hopefully by now it's becoming more familiar. So we have first here, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Peh, Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, and Tav. All right, let's do it again, but more quickly. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Peh, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, well, that's our Hebrew alphabet. Well, let's go ahead and talk about our next letter here, and that's the letter Yod. Yod. So how do we write it? Well, this letter is unique and kind of interesting compared to the rest of the letters, and that's because, as you see here, the letter is actually only written in the top portion of our lines. So this little piece here is not a mistake, and it is unique. So the way you write it here is with basically just a simple line near the top of our space, okay? Then you'll make a a vertical line connecting it so that it's only within this top part of our space. So pretty much all the rest of the letters are going to fill the entire space, but just the Yod is special in this way. So other than that, pretty simple. So let's look at a few other fonts and ways that this letter is perhaps written in case we come across different fonts, and that way we'll be able to recognize what we're looking at. So as you can see here, this one's a little bit of a simplified form. It's a little bit almost more like a comma or an apostrophe or something. This one is very simplified, just a little dash essentially. And so again, this might be confusing if you were to come across this and have never seen it before. But it's just the Yod in certain fonts. Another one here that's a bit more just square and kind of, again, simplified, a little bit less fancy than our biblical text version or font. Well, interestingly, we can also look at some of our earlier or historic versions of this letter. So very early on, and again, the Proto-Sinaitic, which was very early on, we actually had this form which actually represented a arm or a hand. And as we'll see, this is actually the word Yod or Yad for the word hand or arm. So it makes sense. It's a picture of an arm. Well, a little bit later in the Paleo-Hebrew version, as you can see here, as is the case for most of our letters, there's a little bit of a simplifying and maybe a little bit easier to write or maybe even to read and to fit on pages and things like that. But it still represents just the letter Yod. All right, well, let's talk just about a few couple aspects of this letter that are important. First of all, the letter Yod is that Y sound. So for English speakers, this is pretty easy. It's a very transferable sound and letter. We have this in English, so really no different. Now, one thing I will mention here, though, is that in the Bible, there are many names and words that are spelled with a J, for instance, things like Jehovah or Jacob or other words that have the letter J. But in ancient Hebrew, there was no letter J. So every word that you see in the Old Testament that has a J probably actually had this letter Y or the Yod instead. And so it should be pronounced with a Y, which is why sometimes people will say the name of Jesus is Yeshua or Yehoshua. And that's because there is no J in the ancient times. Also, we can just mention here that the letter Yod would have represented the letter or the number 10, especially in later Hebrew. So, for instance, Genesis 10 would have been Bereshit Yod, Genesis 10. All right, well, let's look at a few interesting and key words, especially those that perhaps help us in interpretation or just occur a lot throughout the Bible. And the first one here is our word Yad. Yad. Again, this is the word that is for the letter Yod. Well, our next letter here is the word Yom. Yom. Of course, this is a very common word. We find it in the first chapter of the Bible and even becomes a bit of a controversial word, especially in some of the creation, young earth, old earth debate. What does the word Yom mean? Well, as is true for many words, it has a variety of meanings and uses. But just generally speaking, it does refer to a day, which again could be just daylight hours. It could be a 24-hour period a day, or sometimes just a period of time. So the word Yom is the word day. All right, another couple words that are related and derived from the other are the words Yalad and Yelid. So we can see here, Lad, Lad, and then the other word, Yelid. And so Yalad is the verb form, meaning he bore, and Yelid is the child or the boy that was born. Now, this might seem a little bit weird for us, perhaps in English or in modern times, as we think about he bore, because we think of typically of a woman bearing a child. But in ancient times, it was typical for people to think of the man planting the seed, if you will, sort of like you would into the ground, and then the plant or the tree grows out of the ground. And so it was perfectly normal for the ancient people to think about a man bearing a child just as much as we might think of a woman bearing a child nowadays. So certainly an important and common theme throughout, especially Genesis and some of those chapters where they talk about genealogies. All right, well, we can also talk about this word, Yakol. Yakol. And Yakol is a fairly common word, and it means something like he was able. So you can imagine it often comes with another word paired with it. He was able to do something. He was able to walk or to eat or to save, or perhaps he was not able to do something. So you will see this quite often. Another word which is interesting is this word yamin. Yamin. Yamin is the word for right, as in right hand, but it can also mean south. Now that might feel or sound a little bit weird, but this is actually because in the ancient world, especially Israel, they oriented themselves towards the west, towards the sunrise. It was the easiest identifiable thing in their lives. That was consistent. And so as you're looking to the west, your right hand is towards the south. And so interestingly, this is probably why that name Benjamin, which is actually Ben-Yamin, is implying he was born in the south, right? He was the only son of Israel who was actually born in the land of Israel, as opposed to the others who were born before traveling there. So this is our word right, yamin. All right, well, now we come to a very interesting word, and we'll talk about this a bit more here. And that is these two words here. One is Yeshua, Yeshua, and the other is Yeshua, Yeshua. So Yeshua and Yeshua. Now, the difference here is that Yeshua is the verb, meaning he saves, or he saved, he delivered. And the other is sort of the product of that, right? The noun, he saved, or just salvation, right? The salvation act. So oftentimes when you see the word salvation in the Old Testament, it will probably be this word here, Yeshua. Now, this is interesting because this actually leads us to a very interesting and important set of names. And that is, of course, the names that we derive for Jesus. Jesus. Now, the word for Jesus is actually this word Yeshua, as you see here on the right. But really, Yeshua is a simplified form of the more full name Yehoshua, Yehoshua, much like you would just call someone Ben instead of Benjamin, right? Or Steve instead of Stephen, right? It's just a simplified form of the same name. And so this was typically practiced also in the Old Testament and ancient times. So the name Jesus is really Yeshua, but it derives from the name for Joshua, Yehoshua. Now, this is so interesting because the name Joshua actually means Yah, or Yahweh, the Lord, saves, Yeshua, or Yeshua, right? Or salvation of the Lord. We might even say salvation belongs to the Lord. Now, this is interesting because, as we see in Matthew 1, the angel comes and says that this son that is being born to Mary and Joseph ought to be named Jesus. Again, Yeshua. And it says because he will save his people from their sins. Now, this is really cool because what it's actually saying is not only will he save, but it says his people. And whose people are these? These are the Lord's people. So in a subtle and powerful and deeply Old Testament rooted way, this angel in the New Testament are declaring Jesus to be the Lord who will save his people in the flesh. His own very self will do the work of salvation. Of course, this echoes so many of the prophecies we find throughout the Old Testament, and certainly from Malachi, that last book of the Old Testament. And so, very interesting that Jesus' name is, in some sense, found throughout the Old Testament as it relates to just the word salvation, but also that great conqueror and protege of Moses who led the people of Israel into the promised land. And that is not by accident, right? The name of the great patriarch who led Israel from the wilderness into the land of promise was none other than Joshua, Yehoshua, which is exactly the same thing that Jesus does for his people. He leads his people into the promised land. All right, well, let's look at just a couple more words before we get into our verse. So we can see this word here, yasar. All right, well, let's look at just a couple more words here before we get into our verses. So we have here yasar, and musar. So yasar is the word or the verb for he taught or he disciplined. So sometimes it's translated just as discipline, but really it's more discipline in the sense of to teach or to correct, to provide guidance. And this other word here, musar, again, oftentimes just translated as discipline, but is really in the sense of discipline for a student or a son from a father. So it's correction, it's guidance, it's teaching, more so than just spanking or a whipping or something like that. It has purpose and it has hope in it. It's not just to harm. So let's go ahead then and talk about our first verse. And this is going to be from Deuteronomy chapter 8. And we're also going to look at Proverbs chapter 3 and see how these two verses are integrally related and help us to interpret each other. So let's read this together. So we have Ve'yadata im levaveka. Ve'yadata im levaveka. Ve'yadata im levaveka. All right. So let's break this down just a little bit and do some translating here. So as we've seen so often, we have this begin with the word the, which means and, or sometimes but or so. Again, a few different things it could mean, but here we'll just leave it as and. Then we have yada, which the root word here means to know. So and, know. And then we have this ending here, ta. And we'll talk about this a bit more in grammar later on. But for now, just know this added to a root word lets us know it means you, as in you singular. So, and you will know. Im typically means with. So, and you will know with. And then levaveka. Well, levav is the word for heart. A very common and important metaphor and term used throughout the Bible. Levav, and then ka, again meaning you or yours. Now, this is a little bit different from the one with the tav here, ta and ka. They are related, but the ta, as we'll learn later on with grammar, is for a verb, right? You will know. But this ka is actually telling us it's that pronoun your. So your heart. So think of it as you will know versus your heart. Ta and ka. Okay? So, and you will know with your heart. All right. Then we have ki, ka asher, ye yaser, ish et beno. Ki ka'asher ye yaser ish et beno. All right, let's break this down just a little bit and do some translating. So it begins here with the word ki, a very common and important word that you'll see very often. Can mean something like for or because, but sometimes, as we see here, meaning that. So you shall know with your heart that ka'asher. So we've seen both of these words, but together it means something like just as, that just as yaser. So here's our word that we saw just a few minutes ago, meaning to teach or to discipline, right? As a father does, as a teacher does. And this yod added to the front, again, we'll talk about this more in grammar later on, but this is this sense of he. So he will. And it gives us kind of generic word here, ish, and we've seen this before, but it's kind of just a generic word meaning a man, okay? So just as a man will teach, or perhaps teaches, et beno, so his, right? That's that pronoun added to the end of a word, his son. So just as a man will teach, or he will teach his son, okay? Then we have the next part here, Adonai Eloheka me yasereka. Adonai Eloheka me yasereka. All right, let's break this down just a bit more. Well, of course, this is the name of the Lord here, Yahweh, but we normally just pronounce it as Adonai out of respect, which means Lord. And then we have, again here, a very common combination here, Elohe, from Elohim. So Eloheha. Of course, we just saw this a second ago. This ka means your. So the Lord, your God. And then we have me yasereka. So you can see that root word in there, yasar, right? Which again means to discipline or to teach, to guide, instruct. And so here, this is actually a letter added for a verb type, which gets a little bit more into grammar later on. But just know it means something like to do something, right? So one who disciplines, or one who teaches, and then ka, you, right? So the Lord your God teaches you. So what's he making a comparison here to? He's saying, know in your heart, and he says, and know with your heart, right? Know in the deepest part of your being that the Lord, just as a man disciplines his son, the Lord, your God, disciplines you. So he's saying, whenever you see a sort of a disciplining, if you will, right, a correction, don't take it as a harsh, even mean or wicked thing by just a cold and distant judge who doesn't care. Quite the opposite. God disciplines out of love as a father does to a child. And of course, human fathers are not perfect. Sometimes they do discipline out of rage and even out of sin. But the Lord is not like that. The Lord is perfect and he is good. And he disciplines as a good father perfectly. And again, with the purpose of hope that the son would change and grow and be formed into his own image, into the likeness of the Father. And that's the goal of discipline, instruction from the Lord. So let's now look at another couple interesting verses from Proverbs, chapter 3, verse 11 and 12. And as we'll see here, it's reflecting the exact same idea in teaching, but in wisdom form, which I think helps us to both interpret Proverbs and to interpret Deuteronomy to an extent, understanding that ultimately the picture of good fatherhood, of a good teacher, of true wisdom is found in Scripture and in following the ways of the Lord. This is the biblical picture of discipline and wisdom. So let's read Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 and 12 together. So we have here Musar. We saw that word just a minute ago. Musar, Adonai, Beni, Al, Timas. Musar, Adonai, Beni, Al, Timas. All right. Well, let's break this down here and translate a bit. So we have Musar, Adonai, Beni, Al, Timas. So Musar, of course, as we talked about a minute ago, is that word for discipline or guidance, teaching, instruction. So guidance or teaching of the Lord or from the Lord. And then Beni, so Ben, son. And then if you remember, E added to the end of a word often means my, just like Ka means your. So E means my, so my son. So again, this is that fatherly figure in Proverbs who I believe is meant to sort of emulate or overlay with the Father in heaven. But here he says, my son, the discipline or instruction of the Lord, al, do not, and then timas. And maas means to despise or to reject. And so the T, much like we saw with the ta on the end, means you. So this one means you will. So you will not, or you shall not, despise or reject the discipline or instruction of the Lord, my son. All right, and he goes with this again. So let's read the second part. Ve'al, takots, betokachto. That's a long one. All right, so ve'al, takots, betokachto. All right, well, let's break this down just a bit here and translate. So again, we have that and. So and, all, not. And then again, that ta or t that we just saw, meaning you will or you shall not. So and you shall not chutz, which means to kind of similarly to despise or reject. So and you shall not despise. And then we have this tochach or tochacha, meaning like rebukes or corrections. Again, kind of related to the idea of musar or discipline. And we see here on the end, o, which we've seen quite often, added to the word means his, right? That pronoun his. Now here we do have a preposition added to the front, be, but in English, we don't really need to translate it because it would sound weird to say, you shall not despise in or with his rebukes. But that's really more of an English problem, we might say. In Hebrew, it's often or common, again, to use certain prepositions, especially be, in ways that maybe we wouldn't in English. So in this case, you might be able to say with or perhaps against his rebukes, but it's probably better just to leave it untranslated in this case. Okay, so again, it's basically just reiterating the exact same thing that was said in the previous verse, right? Do not despise or reject the instruction, discipline of the Lord, my son, and do not despise or, again, reject his rebukes. So, verse 12, Ki et asher ye'echav Adonai yokiak. Ki et asher ye'echav Adonai yokiak. So what does this mean? Well, again, we see this word ki, very common. You might want to write this one down. Ki, for, because, or that, as we saw earlier. For, et asher, for we might say the one whom, okay? So this is a little bit out of order for us in English. All right. But we would say something like, for the Lord Adonai Yokiak. The Lord rebukes. So you can see here, it's actually that same root word that we saw in the previous word, tochachto. So tochacha is really from the word yachach. So as we see here, yochach, okay, or yachach. So the Lord will rebuke, or again, correct. So for the Lord will correct et asher, the one whom ahav. And ahav is that wonderful word that means loves. So he will, or that he does, love. So again, it's important to remember that the discipline of the Lord is not a bad thing. It's actually a wonderful thing. It actually tells us that the Lord indeed loves us, that we are a child, a son of the Lord. In fact, we should be more afraid and dismayed if we aren't receiving discipline when we go astray, when we err. And so one of the things that lets us know that we are a child of God is that when we are in error, when we have sinned, when we have gone out of his ways, he will correct us, because that is the loving thing to do. That is what he wants most for us, is to be trained and disciplined to walk in his ways. So let's finish this verse here. And this again drives home the idea of just the goodness and the love of the Father in heaven. So we have here, U ke'av et ben yirtzeh. U ke'av et ben yirtzeh. All right, what does this mean? Well, again, we have another variation of that and word, u. So u and ke'av. So 3 words here, all mashed together. And so we have and like. So that's that preposition, like, or as. Of, and we learned that one a while back now. Father. So, and like a father, et ben, with a son, yirtzeh, he delights, or he will delight, right? So, in other words, the one he loves, the one that he delights in. So the ones that he disciplines are the ones that he loves, that he delights in. We might say has hope for, right? You don't discipline a rock. You don't discipline a tree, right? You discipline a student. You discipline a child. Again, not just out of rage and just, to let out some steam. There is a purpose in the discipline because it's instruction. And you want that person to be better. You want that person to do the right thing. You don't want them to walk in harm's way. You want them to live and to be well and to be happy. And so, again, this is why it's so important that we understand that the ways of the Lord from the Torah in Deuteronomy and the ways of wisdom, as we see here in Proverbs 3, are integrally related. They're not separate things, right? And ultimately, the Father is that perfect picture of wisdom and of goodness as a good Father to us. So let's go ahead and finish up with our Hebrew alphabet one last time. So if you can, do it along with me. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin. Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun. Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, I hope you learned something, and I hope you'll share something. And I look forward to seeing you next time with our next letter, the letter Kaf.
Hey.